Good morning and warm welcome to our speakers and participants. My name is Hian Vu. I am the researcher at SEPS. So today is the second day of the conference on the final events of the Green Steel for Europe project. I would like now to introduce Mr. Peter Troll. He is the Director for Prosperity at Research and Innovation at the European Commission. Mr. Troll will give a welcome and introductory remarks for the session. Mr. Troll, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Yin, and good morning to all. It's a pleasure to introduce the second day. My short introduction can be summarized in one sentence. We have come from far. We are changing the frontiers, both politically and technically. And we will go very far if we are smart in cooperating. So let me start with where we come from. We come from far. This is the Second World War. Jean Monnet's idea of creating a supranational authority to avoid that the industries, heavy industry for war, would be used against each other here in Europe. The coal and steel community was created. This is the founding element of our European Union, and the industrial basis at the beginning of it. And then in 2012, the EU, I fast forward, in 2012, the EU got the Nobel Prize for Peace. And we do see now that it's time to make peace with nature. I'm quoting Guterres, Secretary General from the United Nations. So, and I do see this clean steel ambition exactly in that context. That's what I mean with when I say we come from far. We are changing the frontiers politically and technically. The frontiers, there are several. Look back to 3 years from now. It would have been unthinkable to have an agreement, a consensus, to change the greenhouse reduction targets for emission reduction targets for 2030. There was no vision for Europe to be the first climate neutral continent. This is not a small thing. This is a big thing, the European Green Deal. It is a big vision and project, and it has changed everything we do in all policy fields, in industrial policy, in environmental policy, of course, climate policy, but also in research and innovation policy, if you look at our Horizon program. So we've changed the frontiers there politically. We have made a proposal under the Fit for 55 package earlier this year on this carbon border adjustment mechanism. Politically a no-go, also from the side of industry, not always welcome. But some people here have been at the forefront of arguing for that and making sure that we keep a level playing field when we advance so substantially on our green targets. There's another political frontier we passed, and that is using the assets of the research fund for coal and steel. This is also not a detail. When we started the discussion, and again, people here today were around the table, it was also sort of a bit of a taboo to touch the assets from this former coal and steel community, which was merged with the European Union in 2002. So another frontier we passed, and now we are combining the funding for green steel in this partnership we have for steel. We combine the funds from this research fund for coal and steel from the assets with Horizon Europe funding. So a big step forward also in that respect. Technically, we're also passing frontiers. It's not that long ago that carbon neutral steel production was only just about to be tested in laboratories. Now it's there on a smaller scale, but it's happening. And what I see in industry is that it's still high risk. Companies are testing different technologies in parallel to see what works, what can be brought up to industrial scale. That is showing how big the technological challenge is, and but also how clear and strong our ambitions are. My last point, we can go very far. We've come from far, we're changing the borders, the frontiers, but we can go far with smart cooperation. And here, let me just share an insight. One of the member states, Finland, one of those member states with very ambitious targets, even before 2050, they started to look into what is happening in the different industrial sectors in order, on what is needed in order to come to carbon neutrality. And they found quite interesting things, that every sector was counting on renewable energy. So there's a huge need. We know that now it's quite obvious for renewable energy, but also that there was very little technology spillover between different sectors, that technologies were developed in their own fields, and there was unused potential to bring technologies from one sector to the other and accelerate technology adoption, something where we in Europe are not the strongest. And this is the basis for what we are doing now under the European research area, what we call industrial technology roadmaps. And we want to bring together the state of the art of the technologies across sectors. And we start with low carbon industries. And bring players together, member states, programs, in order to accelerate the adoption of these technologies. And this is also a contribution we bring to the industrial strategy, industrial policy strategy of the EU, where the conclusion was that one of the lessons from the COVID crisis, not only that we need a single market badly, but also that we need to reduce our dependencies from external resources, but that the business case for the green and digital transition was never as strong as it is now, and that we need to co-create, that's our promise, co-create pathways for transition. And we one of the first of these pathways will be energy intensive industries. So if we cooperate smartly, if we go for this industrial symbiosis, what we're also now championing under Horizon Europe with the industrial innovation hubs, the hubs for circularity, we can go very far. So let me conclude here with a bit of a wish. We need very smart cooperation. You can count on us here in DG Research and Innovation to host this cooperation, to support all the necessary steps to bring industrial symbiosis, technology adoption faster, to accelerate the transition. And I would like to thank particularly ESTEP, and I think Klaus Peter is also here, but also SEPS for bringing us together and taking us further on this vision of the first climate neutral continent, starting with steel. And SEPS is also, and Andrea Renda, I think you're also here, he's part of a group which is working on a concept which we launched earlier this year called Industry 5.0. And Industry 5.0 is recognizing that we are in an industrial revolution, and that perhaps we can learn from the previous industrial revolutions, and that we need to look at human centricity, put the ingenuity of the worker in the center, work on resilience, but also take the lead, that industry takes the lead in the transition to circularity, to sustainability. So With that, I think that's our best bet to keep a strong industrial base, to further strengthen our industrial base. And that is good for cohesion. Cohesion is good for democracy, and democracy is good for peace, peace among us, and peace with nature. So the Green Deal is a big deal, and steel is a big part of it. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Ms. Peter Troll. I'm happy to learn that the Commission is aware of the problems and the challenges faced by the sector, not just the steel sector, but the industry in general, and give an overarching perspective on it and calls for collaboration between sectors and stakeholders. So we have here another speaker, Ms. Chen Amiha. She's the head of the unit on low emissions future industries at DG Research and Innovation. Ms. Amihat, maybe you want to have some intervention.
Yes, maybe I will have a few words. Thank you. I'm happy to be here, and yes, I think you had a very productive day yesterday. I think it's very good to have this conference, which address the key elements to achieve our 2050 goals, to have climate neutrality in all sectors, including steel. I will not repeat what Peter said because I can agree with everything. I will maybe highlight 2-3 elements and be very quick. I know you have to go forward with the conference. I think one important element is that we don't only need technologies, and that's what we are doing here to have this green transition. And it's very important, but we also need that these technologies are taken up by the market. And that's why for us, it's very important to develop the technologies together with the industry and to put in place the right framework for these technologies to be taken up by the market. I think to keep EU competitiveness, and it was already mentioned by Peter, but also by speakers yesterday, is very important in this. And I think, for the steel industry, you have a particular case because it's a very international industry. You have a lot of trade, and I think also what Peter mentioned, now with this carbon border adjustment measure, it shows that we can also try to create playing fields, and you see that I think it can push other partners to go in our direction, like we saw now with the recent agreement with the US. I think the EU is a huge market, is the biggest market in the world. So we should also use this, to our advantage, and not only finance and help our industry to become green, but also use this to have a kind of level playing field internationally. So I think it's very important. The second element I want to highlight is that it's very important that we all work together. I mean, we create this clean steel partnership, to really have the industry and the government organization, the Commission and our Horizon Europe program to be created together, that we reflect together what we want to do. And I think it's very important to work on concrete projects with demonstration and scaling up. I think also the financing part is very important. And for instance, we cooperate a lot also within the Commission with the member states, with regions. It's regional level, yes. And for instance, we are working a lot with the Innovation Fund from DG Clima, and I know that the steel industry also presented a lot of projects, and it's very important that we work together. That it's coordinated, and that all these instruments are used together. And of course, I think what you are looking at this policy option, this framework, the framework is very important, like I mentioned in the beginning, to make this a success. So I mean, for us, it's very important to all work together, to have this holistic approach. And and I wish you a very productive day today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Amihat, for your insightful remark. Ladies and gentlemen, before we kicking our session today, I would like to give a few notes on the housekeeping rules of our session. So please note that this is a public event. It is being live streamed on YouTube on the channel of SEPS. And at the same time, we encourage our speakers and participants to disseminate this event through your network. using the hashtag Green Steel for Europe. Please also note that the presentations of today and yesterday's session will be uploaded to our event page. And last but not least, very important, we have 2 Q&A sessions and in which you can participate. So we do encourage you to post your comments or questions in the Q&A box in this Zoom function. Afterwards, maybe I would like to have some few minutes to recap what we have discussed yesterday. So please note that today's 2 sessions are the continuation of a series of 4 sessions in the total in the conference of the Green Steel for Europe project. So yesterday we discussed 2 important topics. One is on the decarbonization technologies, and 2, the investment needs and financing opportunities for the steel sector to decarbonize. So in the first session, the speakers and the participants actively discuss about different technologies that are promising in order to decarbonize the sector. And we came up with 4 important technology rules. We also learned that developing and deploying those technologies will take time and will be stepwise. So that's why we came up with different pathways toward 2030 and 2050 to develop and deploy those technologies. At the same time, very importantly, we also learned that there are different barriers currently hindering the deployment of these technologies, and many of them stay in the areas of policy and funding. And the session calls for prompt action from the EU and the member states to create an enabling policy condition in order to facilitate the deployment of these mitigation technologies. On the second session, we first learned that actually low carbon steel will be much more expensive than carbon intensive steel. And hence there is a massive investment need to develop and deploy these technologies. We also looked into different funding opportunities available at EU, national, but also regional level, and especially the potential of combining those funding programs in order to create a bigger investment mass for decarbonizing the sector. And we also saw different challenges, including the not enough funding in order to finance this investment needs. And then they're still lacking some kind of roadmap in order to make a clear guidance and signal to the investor who want to invest in decarbonization technologies. So both these 2 sessions, we have the participants of different stakeholders, not only from the steel sector, but also from the private sector. We have the European Parliament and the Commission joining us, and also from some voices from academia and think tank. And these 2 sessions ended with some open questions, and many of them are related to the policy and regulatory condition for decarbonizing the steel sector. So I do hope that today, in our 2 upcoming sessions, we will be able to answer some of them. So with this, I would like to now give the floor to our moderator of the first session, Mr. Christian Eggenhofer. He's an associate senior research fellow at SAPS. Christian, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I'm sure we will be giving some answers to the questions you have raised. So good morning and welcome to all of you to the session on policy options. And thank you for joining all the panelists and also the participants. As Jan said, my name is Christian Eggenhofer. I'm a senior associate at SAPS at the European University Institute in Florence as well, where in both areas we're working on this subject, and I will be moderating this. We don't need to explain, I think, a lot about the conference. Peter has already mentioned, and Jane, but also Yen, and he had already 2 days discussions there. Suffice to say, therefore, that the Green Steel project is the EU flagship to identify the effective solutions, which we're going to discuss in a minute, for low carbon steel making. But of course, it's not just steel, it's other materials as well. Peter Troll mentioned shifting the frontier. So that's what we are trying to do. The Green Steel project included analysis of promising technologies. Jan mentioned it was yesterday, the investment needs funding and the policy options, which we will, as you know, discuss here. Following the sessions already was mentioned, there will be another one on the way forward to buttress the next steps in a more detailed way. We have in this panel 6 speakers. Perhaps they reveal themselves on the screen. Maria Spiraki of the European Parliament, the EPP group. Gabriele Morgante, he's a senior policy officer at DG Grow. Here they come. Axel Eggert, he's the Director General of Eurofair, the European Industry Association. And then also Niklas Johansson, he's a Senior Vice President of LKAB. Niklas was a State Secretary before, so he has now moved into business by now. They launched a low carbon steel project, which will be keen to hear. And then we have Susanna Karp, a long-standing analyst of low carbon industrial solutions. Each of them will give us a 3 to 5 minute kickoff so that we have enough time to discuss and going into the harder questions. But we start with my SEPS colleague, Milan Elgabout, who has been leading the policy option work package of the Green Steel project, and he will report the main findings in around 7 minutes. Milan, please, lead the way and stick to your time allocation so that we have enough time afterwards for discussions. I will be strict. Please, Milan.
Yes, please be strict, and thanks very much for kicking us off. In the policy option work package, what we did is, of course, try to stick as close as possible to the earlier work packages and what has been identified there. And what we did throughout the course of the project was really focus on 6 different areas. And I will show them here now and then go through them individually to talk a little bit about what type of specific problems we identified and also some of the solutions. So some of these issues are really quite specific, really related to specific steelmaking routes, and the lack of availability of scraps is one of them. If we can do more with secondary steelmaking, it will be a very efficient way to reduce emissions in the sector. But for that, we need a supply of these scraps, and they also need to be of sufficient quality. So that is one of the first areas we look at. We've also heard yesterday that no matter what way you want to decarbonize the steel sector, you will need enormous volumes of clean electricity. So the steel sector isn't the only one. Basically, the entire economy is relying on a vast volume of renewables being available. That's both good and bad news. Good news because everyone agrees that more is needed. Bad news because there will be competition for this scarce resource. One of the other reasons why we will need renewables is because green hydrogen is one of the most promising routes to reduce emissions to the extent that steelmaking really becomes compatible with climate neutrality, and therefore we need more electrolysis. Then there is the alternative of doing more with carbon capture and use and or storage. But this also requires a lot of infrastructure, a lot of new technology. Then we look a little bit at the existing carbon pricing measures that are already in place. So the ETS basically as the main climate policy for energy-intensive industry. But most importantly, also the general investment and market challenges, i.e. The money question. I will start with that now. So we've heard yesterday that we need to ensure sufficient funding to develop and deploy these new low carbon steelmaking technologies that have been identified. And this is a question both of higher operational cost of OPEX, but also of significant capital expenditure. These are risky investments, and ultimately we will need to have a market for green steel. And this really is one of the most complicated policy areas, because we will need to do all of these things at once. If any of the components is missing, then probably the whole business case will not really be sufficient. So we have looked at numerous options, both at the EU level with funds such as the ETS Innovation Fund, but also support in a more coordinated way through state aid rules or risk mitigation. And again, the market making measures come up again and again as being a very crucial component of making sure that also the private sector will be comfortable with putting money on the table. Closely related to that is carbon pricing. And here, the real question is we already have an ETS. It delivers a price signal of about 60 euros now. That is quite a bit more than in the past, but it is still not quite there yet if you look at the abatement costs to get to green steel, if you want to go with hydrogen-based direct iron reduction or do more with carbon capture and storage. So either we increase the ETS carbon price or we reduce the abatement costs. And throughout the project, we learned that policies that really would result in lower abatement costs tend to be more attractive. But with the Fit for 55 package, there will be some policies anyway that will also lead to more scarcity in the ETS, a stronger carbon price signal. A gap will most likely remain, however, and therefore we have also looked at options such as carbon contracts for differences. So these targeted subsidies that would really bridge the gap between a specific investment and the ETS price of the day. I've already mentioned the importance of renewables. Two specific problems that are important here to tackle by policy. One are the permitting procedures. Today, due to policy actions in the past, renewables are already very cost competitive. The costs have come down enormously, but actually installing them at great speed is still challenging on the ground because you have to deal with local and regional conditions. So anything that streamlines the process and helps accelerate individual projects will be very important here. Another element is electricity storage, because renewables have intermittency and variability, and anything that helps you deal with that will be very important in making sure that the electricity system as a whole is able to deal with a much higher share of renewables. Then for green hydrogen, here, what it's really about is about stimulating the installation of new electrolysis. And in a way, this is a technology that will be needed not just by the steel industry, but also by other energy-intensive industries and also other sectors of the economy as such. It's very flexible and versatile. That's a good thing, although there's also the risk that we then invest too much, perhaps. In any case, for the time being, we still have a lot of conventional hydrogen production. It's still a lot cheaper than green hydrogen. So we will need to approach the expansion of electrolysis capacity as its individual sector by providing very targeted support, also covering the gap between the ETS price, which provides some investment signal, and the cost of operating these electrolysis at a very high capacity. Then on CCUS, we are dealing basically with three different parts of a value chain. You need to capture it first, the CO2. That's one stage, and you would ideally want to do that at a very high capture rate, exceeding 90-95%, so that you don't end up with residual emissions and you have something that is compatible with climate neutrality. But then you also need infrastructure for transportation and for storage. All of these need to advance in unison at the same time. So even more so than with other sectors and with other technology options, this is an area where coordination really is very important, because if this is not coordinated sufficiently, then some parts of the value chain might not be willing to really put their signature and their money down because they are not sure that there will be, for example, sufficient volumes of captured CO2 to actually store somewhere, or that there won't be enough operational storage sites. It's what we
Milan,
call
you will need to speed up, please. Yeah.
Yes. The very last problem then is the scraps availability. And here, the one thing that really came out is that while recyclability is of course a good thing to increase the supply, we should also really focus on quality, so that the type of steel that can be produced through this secondary steelmaking route is sufficient that it can displace other types of steelmaking. In the end, there were a few cross-cutting options as well, and this really come down to the market making. So there are both public and private procurement that would really force demand into the market. Carbon contracts for differences came up again and again, and also the mitigation of carbon leakage risk remains important, so that the private sector is comfortable with putting their money on the table. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you, Milan. We would now like to go to Maria Spiraki, who is a member of the European Parliament, as I said, from the EPP group. Maria, green steel is the future. We all agree. Peter Troll spoke about shifting the frontier. A bit more difficult is, as my colleague Milan also presented, where is the balance between protecting the existing jobs, existing activities, existing assets, and while having enough pressure that companies innovate, invest in the new technologies, and therefore really deploy them at scale. That's what we need in the future. Otherwise, we are not going to make our climate objectives. Please, Maria, what is your take on this or any other points?
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me in this very interesting presentation of your report. I note some issues that I would like to elaborate further, because a lot of things have been already elaborated deeply. I will start with the need that we have to facilitate and accelerate the transition of our steel industry by having sufficient quantity of renewable electricity. And by saying this, I would like to focus on the issue of CCS and CCU, because one of the issues we have to speed up is the regulatory framework. We need a very concrete and flexible regulatory framework when it comes to CCS and CCU in order to facilitate the transformation of our resources for having a sufficient quantity of renewable electricity. By saying this, on the issue of CCS and CCU, I would like to focus on the issue of having CCS and CCU in our industrial hubs or clusters in order to facilitate the industry in there, not only the steel industry. And at the same time, we have to raise awareness on the on people and on the public on the public audience in order to explain to them that the new approach of technology for CCS and CCU are quite safe. We have a lot of exams here in Europe and also in Norway in order to demonstrate the very successful paradigms on CCS and CCU. CCS and CCU is the key, and I think that we are late in this regard. The second issue is also the way that we are providing the legislative framework in order to facilitate the acceleration of transition of our industry. In this regard, I think that the proposal coming from the Commission on the ETS and also on the CBAM, the so-called Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, are also two key issues. The number one issue on the ETS is that here in Glasgow, this month in Glasgow, we face a lack of credibility, action, and committing gap, and we face it coming from other producers countries. I think that we have to bear in mind that we have not to undermine the competitiveness of our industry, and in this regard, we have to take them into account. And going from ETS to CBAM, I would like to focus on the issue of the free allocations. I insist on this, and we have also included in our inner report on CBAM coming from the European Parliament that we have not to have a sudden death when it comes to free allocation to steel industry. We have to have a phase out of the allocation of the allowances to steel industry when the CBAM is fully implemented according to the World Trade Organization regulation. It is important to safeguard our competitiveness, and it is also important to mitigate the leakage that we will face when we have such a competitiveness. And by concluding, I would like to say two words focusing on the renewable electricity. Renewable electricity is the main aspect that we have to safeguard, and by this period of time, we face the problems that we are having in producing renewable electricity and also in renewable electricity storages. In this regard, I think that we have to invest heavily in renewable electricity storage by giving the opportunities to the member states to create a kind of clusters, and at the same time giving the incentives to the industry to proceed with electrifying itself. Thank you very much once again for having me. I think it's very important to communicate your report because a lot of issues must be taken into account when we are now starting the procedure of working on Fit for 55 package. Thank you very much once again.
Thank you very much for your compliments, but also for your views, which I'm sure will be not uncontroversial. Let's put it like this. We'll certainly discuss this a bit further. And also thank you for staying within the time limit. Always a great pleasure for a moderator. Now I suggest we go to Gabriele. I mean, Maria, you will be available until around 11:10, something like this. So we will have a few questions to you before you leave. CCS, CCU, speeding up ETS review, free allocation, CBAM, renewables, not all of you is responsibility of DG GROW. Actually, very little of that is, but I'm sure you have some views on these points. Gabriele, please.
Yes, can you hear me? Yes, so good morning, everybody. Thank you for inviting DG GROW to speak at this event, and congratulations for this very interesting project. Yes, indeed, we have views. We as DG GROW, as Commission, we are fully aware of the challenges. We are fully involved in supporting the steel industry in this in the development of so-called green steel. We know that the transition is difficult, that the next 10-15 years will be decisive. So indeed, yes, it is essential, as Maria rightly recalled, to ensure the necessary framework under which this difficult transition can occur. The challenges have been excellently resumed by Milan in the beginning of the panel, so I will not go through them. There is the investment challenge. We know that the steel industry is expecting a big increase of OPEX, for example, mainly relating to energy inputs. So there is the necessity to ensure affordable inputs. Let me also recall one challenge which maybe hasn't been mentioned, which is the external dimension, which is also very important with the persistent still global excess capacity. What we see in this regard, for example, is that China has started again to rebuild its capacity, to increase its capacity after they left the global forum on steel excess capacity, both domestically and but also offshore capacity, which is also a big issue. So what we did in DG Growth specifically, there are two policy documents that I would like to recall in this regard. The first one is the staff working document on the EU steel industry that has been published with the update of the industrial strategy in May. And it's a document that indeed it takes stock of policy and tools that the EU has at its disposal or in the pipeline to support the steel industry in its transformation. But the update of the industrial strategy has also highlighted the need to accelerate the green and digital transition in line with, of course, the EU Green Deal. And in order to do so, the Commission has proposed collaborative process with stakeholders, which is of course industry, but it's also member states, social partners, and research and technology organization, NGOs, citizens, to identify and co-design possible paths forward. This is what we call the transition pathways. And in September, we have published a document on the transition pathways for the energy intensive industry ecosystem, which touches upon several aspects, and this is interesting, upon several aspects that have been also highlighted as critical in the Green Steel project. Also important to recall that the transition pathway for energy intensive industry ecosystem will build on previous work that we've conducted in DG Grow in the context of the master plan for a competitive transformation of EU energy intensive industries. And this master plan that we published in 2019 was the outcome of 1 year of work together with the energy intensive industry. And it expressed the commitment by the industry to climate neutrality by 2050 and importantly set out concrete recommendations for action by the EU, by member state, and by the industry.
Gabriele, you would also need to speed up a bit, please.
Okay, I'm sorry. Okay, so the reflection on the transition pathways for energy intensive industry will focus on important questions such as what are the main challenges for industry if energy intensive are on the right track to achieve climate targets, what actions are required, which digital technologies are the most relevant for the energy intensive ecosystem or for a specific industry, and indeed what is the enabling regulatory framework that will be needed to support this transition. We will organize dedicated expert group meetings at the end of the year to work on the resilience, sustainability, and the digitalization dimension, and we will gather contribution and compile a final document on energy intensive industry ecosystem transition pathway probably in the beginning of next year. So that's all for the moment from my side. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gabriele. I see you will be busy. Many of the issues you've been mentioning will have to be dealt with, and I'm sure Axel now will tell us that will need to be dealt with very, very fast because time is running out. Industry is ready. We should move ahead. Now, Axel, you heard, the different points which were made. I don't want to repeat them as you have already put up your slides, but we will come back later in the discussion on some of them. So, Axel, yeah.
Thank you very much, Christian. Thanks also a lot for organizing this conference. We believe that the European steel industry can and must be one of the front runners in decarbonizing not only the European industry, but also the global industry. I believe that your report touches upon all the key elements. The question, of course, then is what is then the right set of policy measures? The European steel industry is probably the only major industrial sector that has the ambition set out to reduce its emissions by 2030 by 55%. This would mean, or that means, that in the next 10 years, we will have to reduce our emissions by 30% on top of what we have done until now. This is an enormous challenge. We have set out a number of projects. We have a loan for potential IPCI projects, a number of 54 at a very high technology readiness level. These projects must start before 2030. Investment decisions by the companies have to be done in the next 2 years for that, otherwise it's too late. If we manage with the right policy framework to stimulate this investment decisions by the companies, then we can reduce CO2 emissions of this European steel industry by 2030 by 76 million tons of CO2. That is 1/3 of the entire CO2 emissions in our sector. It is almost 2% of the entire CO2 emissions of the European Union. So we are talking big things, and this is mainly on the blast furnace sites, the integrated steel sites, 10 companies, 20 sites in Europe. So this is quite punctual on certain spots, huge amounts of emissions which could be mitigated. But of course, this needs a huge investment and capital terms, capital expenditure, but also operational costs. So for the next 10 years, 25 billion euros in capital expenditure, and we expect around about 45 billion euros in operational costs, of which the largest part is the energy costs. Low carbon electricity, hydrogen, maybe natural gas, partly in the transition. So this all costs, of course, more than conventional raw materials such as coke and coking coal. Let me just, before I can then go to some concrete proposals, we have the global CO2 emissions of the steel industry on the total human-made emissions is 10%. In the European Union, it's 6%. The share of the European steel industry in the global CO2 emissions of steel industry is 0.5%. But with these projects, we will and we can stimulate global investment if we do it right, and if our industry can stay competitive. And how do we do that? First of all, we need to make sure that we have fair trade conditions. This is the first point, and the European Commission is doing a good job here in the last years to defend our industry against a global excess capacity built up, which then leads to dumping on the EU market. We have 1/3 of all anti-dumping and anti-subsidy measures in the European Union are on steel today, and that is necessary to continue in order to stay, if you want, so profitable, because with dumping, our companies will have to close factories.
You will also need to speed up a bit, yeah.
I will do that. We had in the last years average profit margins of between 2% and 3%. So this is very little to make the necessary investment. So what do we do? Since we have the projects and since the companies are just waiting for having really a certainty that they can manage the investment, we need for the European Emissions Trading Scheme that the current benchmark rules are kept intact until 2030 without increasing the update or making the update rates more difficult for us to achieve. Secondly, on the carbon border measure, this tool which we support, however, it must be tested in the period 2026 to 30 with the full benchmark-based free allocation, because we do not know in how far exporters to the EU, Chinese, Turkish, etc., are able to absorb CO2 costs at the border or to source shift, so only to export to the EU from their most efficient facilities. So the system has to be tested with free allocation and not by removing free allocation. Then affordable CO2 low energy for our industry, that has been discussed in broad terms in this conference already, but that means also decisions for infrastructures have to be taken now as well, because we need hydrogen if we have the technology, but no hydrogen, then we do not make it to our own ambition for 2030. Then we will not achieve 30% reduction in the next 10 years in our industry. So the infrastructures need to be there. There need to be investment in hydrogen infrastructure. There need to be investment in carbon capture, use and storage. Contracts for difference. These should cover the difference between the cost of conventional CO2 of conventional steel making and CO2 low steel making. The idea to say you get the difference between the carbon price and the additional cost to decarbonize will not help, because then we still have 100 euros of carbon costs per ton of steel, and will still be more expensive than our competitors. So we have to be a bit more precise in how the contracts for difference should help stimulate then the take up of this green steel in the market. Then R&D and the scale up has been discussed. You have also seen this on the map, but we need here also to secure the complementarity and facilitate access to the various funding schemes, Clean Steel Partnership, Innovation Fund, IPCI, the Recovery Plan funding schemes, Modernization Fund, Just Transition Fund. So all these schemes, there needs to be more clarity for the companies how to combine them, how to make them complementary. Then the circular economy, just one or two examples. We are a net exporter of ferroscrap, 18 million tons. We need to try to keep this within the European Union for the decarbonization and the circularity of the EU economy. What do we need to do? For example, we must not export steel scrap to facilities which do not meet the European standards. That's very important. Then we need to improve the quality of steel scrap. For example, via the eco-design regulation. The waste shipment regulation will be proposed by the Commission in a few weeks. So that is the opportunity to put also the finger to the export problems which we have, exporting waste scrap to other destinations where it is not treated as it should. Then, of course, incentives for the downstream. We need to find measures via public procurement to take up green steel, which will be more expensive, of course, than conventional steel. There are also options like credits, green credits, for example, the automotive industry, if the sector uses green materials such as green steel. So there are some options to incentivize the take up of green steel in the market, also at a higher cost. And then lastly, we need to work and increase pushing the work on the CO2 footprint approach, because our objective as the European steel industry is, in the midterm, to have an approach which considers the CO2 in the full life cycle. Scope 3, Scope 2, Scope 1. And that in the mid and long term, so in the years 2030, 40, it need to be in place. And then we can also put away all the support measures for the steel industry and establish standards. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. That was a very long list. I'm just afraid, Axel, if we put all this money into steel industry, there won't be much left for the other industries. Let's just go a little bit further. But one conclusion I think we can already draw, which I think is an important one, and that is the steel industry also will have residual emissions. If we talk about net zero by 2050, there will be still significant steel industry emissions. That means we need negative emissions technology to offset that. So every sector will have those, and we should sort of calculating them. They can become rather big, but let's park that for a second. Now let's go to Niklas. You have heard what your colleague from the steel industry says. I understand, there are different views on this, and maybe Maria, after that, we give you a chance to comment. I'm, Niklas, free allocation, CCFDs, all this is a lot of money. Isn't there a different way of getting these technologies into the market?
Thank you, Christian, and thanks for getting the opportunity. Maybe I should just give a short intro. LKAB is a mining and minerals group. And so for this discussion, let me just focus on that. We mine about 80% of all the iron ore in the European Union in our 3 mines in northern Sweden, and we provide around 20% of the iron ore used by the European steel industry. I think most of you have probably heard about our hybrid product that we run together with the steelmakers, SAB, and energy company Vattenfall, where we've taken the value chain approach to decarbonization, how to make fossil-free steel and how to scale it up, using hydrogen made with fossil-free electricity to get rid of the oxygen in the iron ore, which is a problem, This is a process where we take away 95% of the emissions. We've come far, as you know. Like this year, we've successfully in pilot produced hydrogen-reduced sponge iron, DRI, HBI. SSAB have made the first fossil-free steel and started shipping the low quantities to customers for prototyping. And just a few weeks ago, Volvo showcased the first vehicle made out of this fossil-free steel. And we are moving forward now with industrialization and are planning our first demo plant that will be up and running in 2026. Just this one move will cut over 2 million tons of CO2 emissions. That's about 5% of Sweden's total emission. That's the near future, but we see the road. Last year, LKAB launched our new strategy. A strategy we've been working on for years, and a strategy in a mining company, like is not a strategy that takes aim at the first 5-10 years. It's 25 years, massive investments and you need to be competitive in 2040 as well. And one of the fundamental elements of this is that we aim to shift our whole production of iron ore from today's pellets to carbon-free sponge iron. And that will be over 20 million tons of sponge iron of HBI DRI. And with volumes we mine, this reduces emissions at our customers in the European steel industry with over 35 million tons a year. That's equivalent to more than 2/3 of Sweden's entire emissions. So what policies are then necessary for this to happen, and to happen sooner rather than later? And I would say, comment on a few of the things. The first bottleneck we see in this mainly is about permitting, not just in electricity and the renewables. It's for the whole value chain, because this is one of the major bottlenecks and risks in this process. When you're changing whole value chains in heavy industry, you need to have the electricity, the transmission and production in place in order to switch on your direct reduction. And you need to have our customer in the steel industry to have changed to electric arc furnaces. And this has to happen at the same time. While we are different companies, there are different permitting processes, but you have to look at the whole chain to change it. The second one is, of course, electricity supply that you've touched very well on. And what we see here, and when you're getting scale into this, is that this is a paradigm shift for renewables. We as a heavy industry going 24/7 can suddenly see that since it's the hydrogen that will be used 24/7, we can use renewables. We can use the weather-dependent electricity for this shift. And that's today the easiest to build, the cheapest to build in Europe. But again, the permits, the public acceptance, because the extra cost of storing hydrogen is marginal when you look at this at the whole scale. So basically, we see that's one of the major elements that we have to look at in order to make this shift possible for the European steel industry. Make sure renewables are cheap, because that's one of the major costs. Axel touched upon it and others as well. And of course, then it's the price of CO2 and the risk of carbon leakage and the level playing field that everybody is at. And I, to some extent, disagree some with what Axel said, saying that we would rather need to get the free allowances to be dropped sooner rather than later in order to make the shift. But of course, that demands a CBAM that's working. And if we're going to have a CBAM that's working, it's got to be WTO compliant, and that will be much more difficult with free allowances. So we need to make sure there is, for the companies and our investments decision, of course, we need to be very sure that there is a price on carbon and that we can count on it, even though that we see today that the market for this is already here. We are just not able to provide this speedily enough, because the major bottleneck in this is going to be the permits going forward, and be able to take the investment decisions for all the companies involved. And thus I see that those areas are the main areas we should look at: the price of carbon and the carbon leakage, and how to make that happen, and as soon as possible. The electricity supply and the public acceptance and the permits for this, as well as the permits for the whole value chain when you do this kind of change. And if you do this, and you can get scale, and you can get scale in fast. So that's my short intro.
Thank you. Getting scale fast, that's where we wanted to end up, but we're not going to stop yet. Maria, I don't know whether you still have some time to pick up the points, the permitting. Yes, I mean, what can you do? It's very national. I don't think the European Parliament can do much about this unless you tell me differently. But, you know, the free allocation and all the sort of the funding, the revenue streams, I'm sure, you know, the Parliament is the master of the budget in the end. And somehow you will have to allocate all that money. Any point you want to make before you have to leave us, please.
Once again, thank you. I would like just to remind that we are the co-legislator in this procedure, so we have a word when it comes to the legislation. And by saying this, I'll keep some notes, and I would like to elaborate in a few minutes, starting with the issue of the CBAM. I insist on this because I think it is a key issue, and it is an issue that we have to debate with the Commission in order to find a common approach, in order to finally find a consensus between the Commission, the Parliament, and the Council. And this is the way that we will phase out with the free allocations of allowances. The number one issue that we have to have a CBAM which is working, a CBAM which is fully implemented according to the regulation of the WTO system, and then we will end with the free allocation allowances. It is very important. It is also, I would like just to repeat, included in the INI report coming from the Parliament last year. The number one issue is to have a legislative framework which is working and which is not undermining the competitiveness of our industry. The number two issue is, of course, funding. funding and in a way that we can accelerate the expansion of renewable energy. We can also accelerate the expansion of storage of renewable energy, and at the same time the funding that we can use it in order to have installation of CCS and CCU in the industry clusters and hubs. In this regard, I think that our role as European Parliament is to push further in order to have green public procurements in the member states, in order to create a market, a proper and a fit and proper market, a demand in order to supply them with green products, starting with steel, and at the same time to streamline our criteria in order to streamline this market. Thank you very much once again for having me. It was very, very interesting for me as well. And of course, it is a valuable knowledge for the 50 to 55 package that we are working upon. Thank you very much once again.
Thank you very much for being with us. We continue the work we'll be having many more good ideas, to propose to you. So we'll be in touch with you. We are very happy if you want to continue engaging in this debate. That's if I heard that correctly. Thank you very much for being with us, and have a good day and many more good meetings. Okay. Thank you. We have one more panelist, Susanna Karp. Susanna, you have heard all the points. Maybe you want to pick up some of them. I'm afraid you won't be able to pick up all of them, because otherwise you will probably need to speak for about 20 minutes, which wasn't the intention. So why don't you just pick up a few of the points which you consider of the most important, and also to get the discussion going. Susanna.
Good morning, and thank you very much for the introduction and for having me on this panel. I want to actually start by congratulating SEPS and the work that has gone into this project, and especially the reports. I think they are state of the art. They're really what everyone should be reading in 2021. And just like carbon neutral steel, it's not just the end product that matters, but also the process of how you got there. So particularly the surveys that you've run and where you've involved stakeholders, I found those to be incredibly interesting and thought-provoking. I would like to encourage the steel representatives in the audience to have a look at those questions in case they haven't already. But it's really, I think those questions will stay with us for a couple of more years. And I think that the reports and today's discussion takes us a bit further on trying to answer those. Okay, I will just be very quick on policy recommendations, and just to highlight some policy dynamics that are changing and happening, but not before I touch a bit on the timeline issue, because what I've seen in the reports is that we're talking about the 2030s as our short-term window, and then the 2040s as our long-term window. And I want to just very quickly introduce some new dates into the debate, because I really think we should be talking about 2025 and 2035. And of course, then what goes on in the 2040s is, getting closer to the final product. And 2025 is incredibly important because that's what other stakeholders around the world are looking at. And I think we need to be looking at that in the European Union, and to some extent the Commission is doing that. We see it in the proposal on the revised EU ETS. So competitiveness won't be just an endpoint, it'll be a continuous process. So that's why I think it is quite important to utilize those earlier dates to really give us hooks to keep our focus on where we need to go to as quickly as possible. On the question of financing, I think this is really important, and I want to also point out that the EU ETS proposal, the new one, gives free allocation to green hydrogen, and that represents a departure in the traditional way in which free allocation has worked, and in the thinking around it. And there's a very good reason why the Commission proposed that. There's probably several reasons, really, but one of them we can be absolutely certain is that there's no time to create barriers, let's say. And so in offering this financial support to green hydrogen, the Commission is opening up a pathway And also I note they're not using the traditional benchmarks approach, which to me and to many analysts in the space, reading between the lines, it just confirms that the benchmark system isn't working in favor of decarbonization at the speed required. Therefore, it's good to find a different way in which free allocation can work. And I think the introduction of green hydrogen in there represents a departure from our traditional approach to it. Secondly, the carbon border adjustment mechanism is the single most important policy that we have to help us get to 2050. It's incredibly important because it's also a market creating mechanism. So it does create demand for low carbon steel in Europe. And it also, because it utilizes the long-term life of the EU ETS as the long-term price signal, it works much better than a standard, because it's not just about meeting the standard, but it's about giving the signal that we need for investments that will pay off even in the 2040s. It's giving that signal now, even by its long life and predictability. Now, it's also very important to have a CBAM, because carbon contracts for difference interact and operate differently when there's a CBAM in place as when there's free allocation in place. So we need to keep that in mind and understand that the CBAM does meet multiple functions. So quite clearly we're seeing a change in the way free allocation, a departure from its traditional operating way, and the introduction of a CBAM. I think those together can really help the steel industry in Europe. Now, there has been a lot of talk about CCUS, and without me commenting very much on it in Europe, I will just refer to an example in the UK, just from this autumn. The UK government actually decided in its latest publication on industrial carbon capture to not give funding to CCU projects, because, at least not for the early projects, because they said they need to gather further evidence that the abatement potential of these technologies, and also they saw the risk of delaying other necessary investments and delaying action by focusing on something where they actually concluded that more evidence is needed. So I do think that's something to be learned for us from that example, because one critical thing, if we are to meet our targets, is to keep focused. And what's not going to work is what we've been doing until now, which is to say, okay, we do want policies for the long term, but maybe in the short term we want policies that are counterproductive to our goals. I think we will have to go full gear.
You will also need to speed up, Susanna. We want to continue the debate. Yeah,
I can briefly then conclude. I saw an interesting intervention at COP26 this week. It came from the Swedish environment minister, who said that you need to, he said 3 Fs, that you need to support industry and the steel industry in particular to reach net zero. He said you need a framework, you need the financing, and you need friends. I will add a fourth element to that. You need the focus. And in terms of kind of how all of these come together, and some advice, just perhaps I have some points of advice to the steel industry, is that I think the best thing the steel industry can do right now is make friends with the renewables industry, lobby strongly for the renewables industry, because that's a key resource constraint that's not likely to disappear in the short term or the medium term. So do make friends there. And advocate for renewables, make friends generally across the value chain, and with other stakeholders, and keep focused. So I think with that, I'll stop here, but glad to join the debate and answer more questions.
Thank you. I mean, Axel, Niklas, I'm sure you have friends, you have lots of friends from the renewables industry. Maybe we have a little bit less friends from the people who live close to renewables production facilities, but that's such is life. Thank you, Susanna. We'll come back to this. I would like to briefly give the floor to my colleague Milan, and then back to Axel, who may have a few things to say about CCS, CCUS. I'm sure he has something to say about free allocation. And then I'm almost sure that Niklas will get back onto this. But Milan, I think the timeline, which Susanna has been mentioned previously. Maybe you also have a quick word on the funding and how it relates to the free allocation and all this, which seems to be an issue coming up. And maybe the point about standards, green public procurement, etc., etc. They look compelling, but the devil is very often in the detail, and it looks also how static these products are. Now, I'm not going to preempting your answers, but just a few points. You've been leading the work here, so you know all the technology options. Then we go to Axel, and then I guess Nicholas will switch on his video again. He will have to say something on Axel. Milan.
Yeah, thanks, Christian. First, on the timeline, we have a detailed ETS proposal now. One of the headline proposals for that is a change to the trajectory of the cap, always one of the most important elements of a carbon market. And with that proposal, with the linear reduction factor, the cap would reach 0 in 2040. That's not a very long time from now. And that means that there isn't a lot of time to very significantly reduce emissions in all ETS sectors, including the steel sector. Now, residual emissions were already mentioned. There might indeed be some of that, and there is work ongoing on certifying carbon dioxide removals, but the volume of that will probably be small. If you take 5% of the old ETS cap, when the system was introduced, you're talking about 120 million tons. Also, as we have seen from the Swedish example, the steel industry does not have intrinsic residual emissions the way some other industrial processes have. It is possible to do 0 greenhouse gas emissions steel production. Then on free allocation, in recent years, the steel sector received a bit over or well over 100 million ETS allowances every year to mitigate the risk of carbon leakage. With the carbon price of today, that amounts to 6 billion euro every year in an asset transfer from the public funds to the industry. It is not unreasonable, given the challenges of before 2030 and definitely by 2040, when there is the ETS scarcity, to have a return on that in terms of decarbonization. So for that reason, I think we need to think very carefully how we hand out free allocation, how it interacts with things like carbon contracts for differences and the CBAM, and that there is investment coming forth in return for that. Then finally, on green public procurement and standards, they are indeed very attractive. Also, the idea of a standard, just like is already in place for cars, for example. You could, in theory, mandate that any steel production should have a limit in terms of the embedded carbon. And then if there are international producers outside the EU who exceed that, they simply would not be able to sell in the EU. It would therefore also be a competitiveness and carbon leakage risk measure. However, here the WTO may also have some very strong views on the legality of such a measure. Similarly, with public procurement, the idea is very simple. We spend around 14% of GDP on government spending, some of which also goes to materials that are energy intensive. Why not make it green? But there are enormous information asymmetries, knowledge gaps, very complex administrative procedures that do not necessarily make it easy to accelerate green steel making in the short run. It is nevertheless a promising area, but we should also still look to private procurement. There are many examples of companies that do have very thick margins and that want to decarbonize across all of their supply chain, also scope 3. And if they want to then have proof that the steel that is somewhere in their supply chain is green, that can also be a very important component of creating a market for green steel.
Thank you, Milan. Lots of points, challenges. Axel, I see you would like to respond to some of them. I'm afraid you'll probably not be able to respond to all of them, otherwise we run out of time. But just, pick pick the most important ones, please. And then I would also like to give the floor to Niklas and then to Gabriele, of course. If you want then also to make your take on what you have heard. Axel.
Thanks, Christian. On Susanna, on the CCUS support, if we do not support this now, we may lose this technology. CCUS will be needed as an additional technology to reduce CO2 emissions on top of hydrogen-based steelmaking, for example. We will have rest CO2 emissions, which have also to be covered. And we have a good example, by the way, that companies can invest now and are doing so in both technologies. Look at ArcelorMittal in Ghent. They have the Stellanol project on carbon capture and use. And at the same time, they are now installing DRA and EAF technology where they want to use hydrogen. So it is possible and it is being done. But of course, the investment security for those projects needs to be there as well. So there's the legal framework is still extremely important to make the last or the final investment decisions to scale up and to implement these projects. On the free allocation phase out, Niklas, you basically give the reason yourself why we are asking not now to phase out the free allocation based on the benchmarks, which, by the way, today is a 25% shortage in our industry, where we have significant costs already today by a carbon price which is more than 1,000% higher than 3 years ago. So this is hurting our industry, it's hurting your customers. And if the CBAM, the CBAM needs to be tested with a carbon levy at the border to be sure that it works. Otherwise, companies who export to the EU, who export usually between 1% and 5% of their entire production to the EU, so a relatively little share if you want so, they can easily source shift or absorb this cost, absorb the costs at the border only to keep the market share and wait until our industry cannot bear the costs anymore. So we have to be very careful, and our request is to test the system with a carbon levy in place with current benchmark rules, benchmark levels, which already is a burden for our industry. And then I must ask, what is more important, to decarbonize the industry or to reduce free allocation? Because we are ready as an industry and we can sit together, and we have requested that from the Commission and the member states to sit together with our CEOs and to hammer out a deal that the investment decisions can be made in the next 12 months. So these are, I think, very important points. And WTO, we have one of the best lawyers or group of lawyers who all say the CBAM is absolutely WTO compatible. There's no rule in the WTO rules which says it's not possible as long as you do not discriminate. And that is what we are also asking. Do not discriminate imports. And it is possible. It is also possible with free allocation. As you know, no one went to the WTO complaining on that. With the CBAM, it will be similar, hopefully. Okay, Axel, thank you. Just to clarify maybe a point, I think, Axel, the reference from Susanna was very much on the CCU part, not so much on the CCS. But, indeed, you know, okay. Stellanol. Now, sorry? Stellanol is CCU. Okay. All right, Susanna, here you have, I think you need a coffee, the two of you.
to discuss this, or maybe you need more than a coffee. Maybe it takes a bit longer. Niklas, yeah, you want to comment on this, but also I picked up while you were discussing, or while in the discussion, I picked up the issue about OPEX support. We've been carefully treading around it. You know, CAPEX support, yes, I guess we all, you know, understand that. OPEX support is a little bit more controversial. Niklas, you know, want to comment on this free allocation, but then we stop the free allocation part. I get a feeling we don't agree on it. And then Gabriele, and then also Susanna may be a few points.
I think that if you're looking at the free allocation part and the whole ETS system, we must make sure it works as a level playing field, and that if you're looking at the future and how to do this, you need to start reducing the free allocations in order to really do this. And I think it's a good time. The faster you do that, the better, even though I completely agree with Axel that yes, you need a CBAM that's working, it needs to work, and there are complications, administrative issues here, why it's important to do it, but it shouldn't be taken as an excuse to not start doing things with free allocations and reducing it. I think it's needed, and the whole industry as such, we need to get used to this, because this will be the new normal. And I'm not as worried when it comes to the market, because what we see and what we hear from our customers and our customers' customers is that they want this and they want it now, not later. So I'm not as worried about the market mechanism here for this change to be able to happen. And then you come into OPEX and where should we as a union spend our money for the decarbonization and how to do this. And I'm looking very much into the electrification issue and what to do, because everything this comes down very much to the expanding of renewables and how to do that. So when we should look at this, and that's what we're doing, I think that Susanna took it up, and I think she pointed out a very, very important issue to have focus when we're on the road forward. And that focus should very much be in the electrification case, which not only help the steel industry, but all the decarbonization of our societies. And if we continue to look at this just from our industry perspective and into this, yes, that's the most important for us, but it needs to comply and needs to work with the whole society. And for us, the expansion of renewables in Europe is a key factor. If we can't do that and have that working fast enough, the change in the industry value chains won't be possible. And basically, looking at the whole the way to carbon neutrality, there are two things we really need to focus on. It's the phasing out of the fossil free and rebuilding the more of renewable, but that's a well-known topic. And the other thing is, of course, the raw material value chains that needs to change. It's not about the vehicle manufacturers' electricity used in their factory for the robots, which is the main thing. It's the raw materials that go into it and their chains. So really focusing on those two issues. How do we make, and Peter made that comment in the beginning, like how do we create these paths for transition? And there is time, the market is there. I think this is possible, but we really need to work together with it. And then we need to focus where we put our money in doing this. And I think that putting more money into the electrification issue, that's also what will take down the factor costs for us as industries when we do this change, is an extremely important element in this. Thanks.
Thank you, Niklas. Yeah, where we put down the money, I think that's, will be in this discussion we will have for a long time. I mean, we will have for some time. We cannot wait for too long, obviously. But I think the demand point you mentioned, the customers want it now. Surely I would expect there is a certain demand for these products, at least as long as we have relatively low volumes. And when you look at the car. There is analysis which tells us a car which uses low carbon steel costs around 400 euros more. If you look what an electrical vehicle costs, 400 euros, is really nothing. So if you look it from the overall value of a final product, the demand the extra cost may not be big enough. So that may also be an area to look at. Now we have about 9 minutes, which we need to be sharing between Gabriele and Susanna, and then also with me to give a few comments backwards. And once we've done, just wanted to let you know, please stay online until we stop the recording, so that we all finish, with all smiling into the camera. Please, Gabriele.
Yes. No, I don't have much to add to the discussion. As you can imagine, on CBAM and DTS, we were participating in the consultations before the proposal was stable. So now it's there, and that's it. So on this, we cannot comment on some other points that have been raised by Maria, for example, on funding. Yes, indeed. I think it's also important to recall that there is now several possibilities under as far as funding are concerned. There is the Clean Steel Partnership, as you know. There are already calls on this. There is the Research Fund for Coal and Steel that Peter Droll has recalled in the previous panel. Some of these fundings are in the hands of the co-legislator, like the new innovation fund under the DTS proposal. There is the InvestEU fund, and also from member states some possibilities that have already been recalled by Axel, like IPCIs, and the new possibilities offered by carbon contract for difference under the new energy and environmental guidelines. On the creation of market, also we know this is also a very important point that was already highlighted in the work that I recalled before, that we had with the energy intensive industry under the master plan. And it's also something that is mentioned in the staff working document on the transition pathways. On this, you might know that there is under discussion an initiative that might be very important for this. It's a sustainable product initiative. I cannot say much because it's still very much under discussion within the Commission. We might adopt a life cycle approach, so from the raw materials to the final product and recycling, building up on the experience of the product environmental footprint pilot project. And this will be important because if you want to if we speak about public procurement, of course you need and you want to promote the green steel, you need to know what green steel is. So on this, for this, a definition is essential, and in this regard, the sustainable product initiative might be of help. So that's all from my side. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Gabriele. Thank you for joining us. Susanna, 2, 3 last points. Can I suggest we are not going to go into the CCS, CCUS debate? We have already delegated to a coffee or some more serious undertaking between the two of you. Any other point you have picked up you would like to highlight?
Yes, I would like to highlight a point that, strangely enough, we haven't really touched on, but obviously the recycling aspect of it is critical, and I realize it could have come up, but anything that can be done to actually improve and create more higher value products from recycling, that would be very helpful, of course. So while we keep focus on electrification and renewables deployment at scale, we should also keep focus on this, because it would certainly only help going forward. I have no interest in talking about CCU and CCS, but I did not expect that free allocation would be presented as a separate issue from emissions reductions, because if that's the case, then perhaps we don't need free allocation, since the rationale was to support emission reductions. And now we have 16 years worth of analysis we can carry out, and we have seen numerous reports coming out highlighting exactly the ways in which the way free allocation works currently prevents some of the reductions that could be already happening. So perhaps, and I think the Commission has taken some first steps in this direction, but I think it's good to rethink the way we're allocating any free allowances, if we are. And clearly, there is an opportunity to do that with industry. But again, I think a constructive dialogue would be very helpful, and just a realistic take on where we are with this system, because I think it's just not credible to really continue saying that it's working when it's not. So if we can find a way to overcome that barrier, I think that would be in everyone's interest and benefit for, you know, the Fit for 55 package to be a success as well, and satisfy all the stakeholders.
Thank you, Susanna. It will also be an issue I'm sure we'll be discussing for quite a while in the context of the ETS review. And I'm sure, you know, many different people have made their positions known, and it's now up to the co-legislators to take a decision. Let me bring at that moment the meeting to a close. First, I want to thank all the panelists and people listening in, and I saw we haven't lost hardly anybody, so the discussion was interesting enough for people to stay on. But before we close here, I would like just to make a couple of points. I have noted down 5 points for which struck me. The first one, I think, is really the CCS, CCUS. Yes, there is an innovation part, but you have, of course, also on the sides, you know, quite a few old blast furnaces which are around, and they will not be all replaced in the short term. So that is some element we should keep in mind, whatever then the discussion will be. Gabriele, there is a call that you should make the link available of your key documents you have mentioned. Maybe you have time, put it into the chat, and then people can have them. So the first point, you know, let's do away now with the CCS, CCUS. It's a complex issue which merits further discussion. I think that the second point was there will be a residual emissions, and there may not be, but certainly looking at the residual emissions and when they will occur, and you put them on record because they need to be dealt with. Permitting, the third point was brought up, and the whole area of the renewable energy, the whole area of resource, including scrap, etc., etc. A very important point, which was highlighted several times. The market demand. Here again, there seem to be different views. One seemed to be going more towards sort of government-led activities, while there's another element where people feel more comfortable with the private or corporate or market-led demand. I think an interesting area to look at, and maybe also an interesting area to watch. And then finally, I don't want to conclude here on the funding. I think it's maybe too early, maybe too difficult. But one of the principles I heard from all the participants speaking up is here. In the end of the day, you know, the funding needs to be structured in such a way that it really drives the decarbonization, that it pushes the decarbonization. And it will also be structured in such a way that there is a level playing field between the incumbents, the new technologies, but also the new entrants. There may be new entrants, there may be new materials, you know, substituting steel, you know, heaven forbids for you, but it may happen. And these new materials, these new tools, these new technologies will also need to find a market. Therefore, level playing field and driving the decarbonization at the same time will be really the litmus test for any of the funding. And of course, politically, it's always very important to maintain the existing jobs and assets, etc., because that's how the votes are won and lost. We understand this, but over this, we need, of course, to see how this drives in the future. Now, I just see we're landing at 11:45. We couldn't be any better than this. Let's conclude it here. And I hand over to Yen, who will introduce the next session. But before doing this, thank you again very much for your contribution. And I hope we see you again in future debates on this. So thank you. And that session is now concluded.
Thank you, Christian, and the panelists for this exciting discussion. We saw that there are many challenges and bottlenecks in different areas, and we think that the conditions to decarbonize the steel industry hasn't materialized yet. So I think these ideas can pave the way for session 4 on the way forward. With this, I would like to introduce Andrea Renda. He's the Senior Research Fellow at SAPS, who will moderating this session. Andrea, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Yen. Thanks, Christian, for masterful moderation of the previous session. Thanks to all the speakers, which to a large extent already put us in forward-looking mode, right? Because the session 3 was looking at policy options. We heard the results of the Green Steel for Europe project in terms of laying down the potential landscape, the perimeter of the potential policy options that could be pursued. We've heard also about the complexity of putting them together and, most importantly, prioritizing those policy initiatives over time. We've also heard how difficult is the combination of, let's say, technology-related investments and the framework conditions that are equally important. The funding, the permitting, the reduction of bureaucracy, the reduction of transaction and administrative costs, all the creation of an ecosystem and a setting that is conducive to the ambitious pathways that we have forward. We've also seen the ambitious attempt of the Commission, through the words of Gabriele in particular, in trying to launch what has been announced already this year as basically the new way of projecting into the future in the industrial strategy of the EU, which is the creation of those transition pathways, which is something that this project has been contributing to by laying down potential alternative futures, if you wish, for the decarbonization of the steel industry. We've also heard references to the external dimension and the geopolitical issues that might constrain the possibilities for Europe to really embark in a substantive way, in a determined way, on future transition pathways. So all this we now package together in this final session, final panel, session 4, where we look at basically what's next. And I would say mostly the idea is to look at what's next in terms of prioritization, meaning we all know that many of those initiatives, many of the policy options, for example, that Milan has illustrated at the beginning of session 3, are complementary. Some of them are potentially alternative, but most importantly, they need to be sequenced and prioritized. And in order to do this, we will ask the speakers in this panel to give us their view of what's most important and what they see as the key steps going forward. But we also want to ask the participants to help us prioritize. And this is why we want to launch at the beginning of this session a poll by using Mentimeter, where we have sort of selected a number of keywords, basically, of, say, policy areas. And obviously, you will probably tell us all of them are important, but we would like to know from you which ones you think should be prioritized. So I don't know how familiar you are with Mentimeter. I see that the slide was on. It is now, I think, not readable anymore. So, okay. So basically what you have to do here to go to this website, www.menti.com, and enter the code for this meeting, or simply use this QR code with your smartphone and you will be sent to the environment where you'll be able to choose between a number of potential policy areas. So I'll give you a few seconds to do that. Meanwhile, I don't know if we can show for a second the keywords, basically the policy areas that we've chosen. Perhaps I will go through them very briefly, and then we go back to the QR code in case someone has not had the time to click. So now the question is, which elements play the most crucial role here by the prioritization, let's say, aim of this survey in advancing the decarbonization of the EU steel industry? Is that innovation? We need to foster additional innovation. Is this market creation, including through obviously public policy measures? Is this corporate responsibility in taking on the challenge of decarbonization over time? Is this the availability of additional funding, or better funding, or more streamlined funding, or more multi-level funding resources? Is this sector coupling? Well, we see the effort of the Commission also in going into the direction of ecosystems in the industrial strategy. Is this the issue that was heavily discussed in the last session of carbon pricing? Is this the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, that is to be prioritized, or that is going to play the most crucial role? It is the availability of renewable electricity and the conditions related to this. Is this green hydrogen that Milan has commented on in particular in the last session? Scrap availability, we will hear from some of the panelists also additional notes on this. Or is this also the heavily discussed issue or say the rather controversial issue of carbon capture, utilization, and storage, CCUS, that you've heard also in the previous panel. So perhaps you go back one slide to just give the possibility to the participants that have not done so to again use the QR code, or to enter the code. One thing that we could actually do, perhaps, to also type the code number and the website on the chat as we move forward, because we're not going to be able to keep this slide on for the full session. So I'll probably ask Ken or Christian to do that, so that in case someone is or needs to sort of recall the code and the website for Mentimeter, they can still do this, even if they will not be able to use the QR code, because this requires that we visualize it on screen. So now moving on to the panelists that we have today for this session. We have 6 panelists, so we have a rather packed session. Once these 6 panelists will have gone through their first rounds of interventions, we'll see whether we are ready to show the results of the poll, so that we can comment on them with the panelists themselves. So please make sure that while you hear those first round of interventions, you're also able to go to the website of Mentimeter and give us your thoughts on what should be prioritized, what elements will play the most crucial role in this ambitious challenge of decarbonizing the EU steel industry. So the panelists, you see them there lined up. We will start with Alejandro Germán González from the Research Executive Agency. That will take the floor first, also to give us a view on the prospects for continuing the funding in terms of research and innovation of the related to the pathways towards decarbonizing the steel industry. We'll have Jonas Fernandez from the European Parliament. You've heard already from him yesterday, and from the S&D group, will give us his view about what should happen next. We'll have Johanna Lehne from a think tank devoted to climate change, she's based in Brussels, senior policy advisor at E3G. We'll hear again from Thorsten Haug from BFI, it's a nonprofit research institute where he has been, well, obviously actively contributing and taking the lead on some of the research activities in Green Steel for Europe. We'll hear from Pietro Gimondo from Centro Sviluppo Materiali, where he is a manager of research affairs. And we'll hear once again from Milan Elkerbout from CEPS, who will also give us his views, perhaps also based on this experience that we had on Green Steel for Europe. So let me move to Alejandro to get us started, right? Alejandro and all the panelists, if I can ask you to activate your video right now so that we can have as much as possible the impression of a live debate and an almost in-person debate. So Alejandro, I give you the floor for we said 7 minutes. Let's take it, in a relaxed way, as we are the last session. We can look back to what has happened in the discussions in this conference and in the project, and perhaps while stock taking, take a chance to look forward a little bit. So Alejandro, I give you the floor. Thanks for being with us today.
Okay, thank you very much, Andrea. Thank you very much for everyone participating in this very interesting conference. Yes, I hope in the poll, innovation doesn't come at first. That would mean that we are doing our homework, and the work remains for other of my colleagues more in the policy area, which I think it will be the case, because I am very, very positive on what's being done in the last few years in innovation, as Peter Droll very well said, and he have to say that Peter was fundamental to these developments, and of course the industry. But let me also expand a little bit the views on what's the general context of the world we're living in, I would say, because just in very recent days or weeks, we're seeing the huge impacts that the energy prices are having in an economy, the consequences in transport, logistics, industry, inflation, all in all. And we cannot avoid this thing. And we can see several, so to say, geopolitical movements around this. And one could be the resistance of the fossil fuel producers to this green transition. So we need to understand that in this context, the geopolitical context and relations will be crucial, because mainly the history of geostrategy is the history of energy, and energy is so fundamental to what we're doing now here. We have just heard multiple times on this conference, especially Niklas just mentioned about the price of renewable energies, the possibility. We had Lena yesterday, even the difference within one single country, Sweden, North and South have different conditions for the producing green energy, fundamental for green hydrogen, and so on. So there has been a boom in investment in renewable energies, and there is also the creation of conditions, of Gabriel explained very well, the taxonomy and other investment conditions that are now reinforced with many funds for this transition. And this proves that the EU is a regulatory powerhouse which has influenced an economic change in a global scale, not just a European one. But so the challenge is there. We have been able to put this challenge, climate challenge, in the center of the debate. COVID-19, even like things like deforestation, are increasing the appearances of new viruses that transmit from animals to humans. So it's all very interrelated. And as Peter said too, COVID-19 has put also more in relevance the need for an independence in this global value change, both in energy and in production, which makes it very, very clear that we need to move on. So, of course, these challenges cannot be done by a single country, has to be a large scale. But yeah, we need to, I think we have to be very optimistic on where we are at now. I mean, always keep optimistic. The world has also been facing challenges, so why not this one? Everyone knows right here, I mean, the importance of the steel sector in the world. And I would like to take the opportunity to thank here all the participants in the Green Steel project, because it continues a number of existing projects, starting with Ulco's low carbon future. Green Steel is, and personally thank Jonas Fernandez, who initiated the European Parliament efforts to bring this initiative to life. And that is really providing the right roadmaps, information, combining and having, as my colleague said before, the right combination of getting industry, fostering conversations, having everyone working in the same direction. So as regards, I'm coming back to steel and these technology pathways that were discussed very well by Thorsten yesterday. These technology pathways, let's keep in mind that the R&I scenarios, funding scenario has intensified drastically in the last 3 years. We have seen the reinforcement. Probably 3 years on, we couldn't believe that we could open the assets from like the 50s or for the coal and steel research fund. The creation of the Clean Steel Partnership, synergies with Horizon Europe, first time synergies of two funds coming together in a creative manner to put these funds, the growth and power now of the Innovation Fund, the appearance of the IPCIs on energy intensive industries, Invest EU, leveraging with a huge amount of money in funds, and of course, don't forget the Next Generation EU, the recovery plan that we will finance 1/3 of the European Green Deal. So it has happened in the last, say, 3 years. So why not? No, moving on in the future. So this, of course, we have to have an integrated approach, and the system is designed as a toolbox. I mean, from the European perspective, EU perspective, with different solutions for different levels of development and maturity stages. So we are trying to cater all type of TRLs. We're trying to avoid funding gaps at any stage. This has been a work together with industry and with investors and with member states to find and of course Green Steel comes back again into this looking at scenarios, looking at funding gaps. So we now can see for the future a very interesting combination of technologies. So we need to make sure that no stone is left unturned, and all technologies have a place to develop, and allow for funding support in all TRL levels. We've talked about the synergies of funds, the scaling up with Innovation Fund from the Clean Steel Partnership results. The looking at different technologies and making sure that we at each time fund the technologies that are open the possibilities, but also fund the winners. So allow the market to choose the winners and move faster and maybe react over time. Because with my example at the beginning of the recent price of the electricity, we have to understand this is a very dynamic market, but money is also conservative. So we need a long-term stability in the regulatory framework. We need to also certainty about the effectiveness of the carbon leakage measures, and robust and credible protection of it against these unfair trade practices that allow for the long-term investments. But I think we also need to be creative into leaving the market also grow, and we're seeing that too. We're seeing that new companies are being created. We were talking about the Swedish example. We know that the hybrid is an example, like you mentioned that, but also there's H2 Green Steel, which is an investment platform that is going to in the same direction. It's exactly what we want. We want to create new companies. We want to create new competitors and alternatives. And you very well said, well, Christian very well said about the what about new materials? We have to be ready for these changes. So it has to be very, very dynamic. So in summary, I just analyzed our efforts need to be continuous, dynamic, ready to adapt to the ever-changing circumstances. We have to provide long-term certainty, but always these roadmaps will keep changing. Will keep changing. This technology proposed yesterday by Thorsten, several scenarios. We'll see different scenarios in 4 years' time, 3 years' time. So we have to be ready for that, and we have to be ready that this is complex systems, and that when you change one thing, other will change. So we need to be ready for this change too. And look, I finalize with a quote from Bill Gates that when someone asks him, he says, whenever someone talks to me about decarbonization, Bill Gates says, I ask them, what are your plans for steel? So that means, I mean, Bill Gates is one of the richest man on earth, and probably one of the investors, now we see in breakthrough technologies. And I think he has some sort of a criteria here. I would say that in Europe, we have a plan for steel. It has been demonstrated in these sessions. So let's make it happen. Let's start with this plan, and we'll achieve a good target at the end of the road. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alejandro. So a message of continuity, if you wish, rather than major deviations from the existing path. I was wondering maybe if I can ask you a quick follow-up question, whether in the Research Executive Agency you are keeping open, let's say, or if you wish, technology neutral in this respect by looking at potential alternative future pathways and thereby adopting what is sometimes called a portfolio approach, meaning betting on different potential future solutions and technologies, also potential alternative materials in funding research, and knowing that perhaps some of these projects will fail and some will succeed, and that is in the end what is important, right? Managing a full portfolio of projects where perhaps the competition with these projects will eventually determine the solutions that will eventually be implemented on the market. I don't know if you have something like that, because I know it's been implemented, for example, in the emissions in Horizon Europe a little bit more, or is supposed to be. Is the Research Executive Agency executing a broad, let's say, set of
we are certainly we're not closing any doors yet, and it is a result because now the research from Foucault and Steel has been somehow well kept. The ensure that we'll keep with the some 40 million a year, but it has so the research, the traditional, more incremental in technology, so we understand need to continue happening, like blast furnaces, etc., is still there. And we're also implementing now the part of the Clean Steel partnership, and that is more open to different technologies. This has been also being agreed with the industry. Why? Because there are different types of technologies developed by different producers. So we need to we don't choose a winner now. We leave everything open. There are different conditions also in different parts of in Europe. For example, in Sweden, there's more access to the direct iron ore mines and renewable energies. In Southern Europe, there probably will be more sun and more hydrogen. And currently, the situation in more Northern Europe, it's of a bit different energy mix and more traditional blast furnace, or say in Austria, for example, more water energy. So we leave these options open. Now it's fairly open these first years. What we are doing in the first years of the partnership is 7 years. We will see what happens. We will get this feedback, and the partnership board is meeting continuously to take on these results from projects and start changing the objectives as we go. This is not a fixed picture over the next 7 years. So what will happen in the next few years, we have to plan ahead, 2 years work programs, but this will surely change over time. And by 2027, probably the picture will be different, but we want everyone to compete, because I think it's important that we of course keep competitiveness here. That's why companies get together also to have their opportunity to compete, not just to give away their technologies, or so this is a bit of a balance there.
Thank you very much, Alejandro. And then you mentioned also the intensification of the research and innovation landscape, but also the industrial policy landscape, in particular at the European Union level. So I was wondering whether I can ask Jonas Fernandez to take the floor. I mean, and perhaps at the end of your remarks, if you can also say something about this, because this is coming to the Parliament at the same time, right? Are we having too many North Stars, let's say? Are we using too many of these tools? Or is there a need for streamlining some of the funding instruments that we have? Also because we have them at different levels of government. So in particular, the Next Generation EU obviously tries to encourage member states to spend it meaningfully the funds towards decarbonization, in particular with the earmarked percentages. But at the same time, will these investments be compatible with more pan-European plans? And that is something that if you want to say something about, but in general, I will invite all panelists to say something about it because it's for the coming years. So Jonas, over to you. You're welcome back. You almost opened the event yesterday, so welcome back to this event.
Okay, now thank you, Andrea. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here again today in this conclusion of the meeting. I maybe taking into account what Alejandro said before me, and from a regulatory point of view, I think that we need to do more on energy because, as Alejandro said, in the last few months we have seen a very relevant increases on energy prices, electricity, but not only electricity. And of course, if we really want to advance in green steel, we need to review the regulation of our energy markets and maybe more on electricity, because we are invested so much in renewable energies. These kind of energies have a very, very low marginal cost. And the current marginal market that we have in electricity, I think that does not internalize properly the effect of this great investment in renewable, because at the end of the day, electricity, or we have to pay the highest cost of the last unit of energy that we demand. Hello? Sorry. Yeah.
Yes, no,
Sorry. No, I think that we need to rethink the framework of our electricity market, because the kind of energy that we will have in the future, that will be very different from the last few years, and the marginal system is not appropriate to pass through the reduction of cost that the renewable energies allows us. So first, this idea from a regulatory point of view, we need to rethink the regulatory framework of electricity market. Second, and also from a regulatory point of view, as you know, we are now working on CBAM. This proposal or this idea has been in the corridors of Brussels for many years. But it's true that until at the end of the day, this mandate, this idea was only a bubble or a rumors, but everybody feared that this kind of measures could create some problems in the WTO or other problems that we saw in the last few years when we had Trump in the American presidency, when the war at the end of the day was in a battle about tariffs or quotas or so on. But now, and in the context of the decarbonization, this project has gained a momentum. We have now a proposal on the parliament, and we need to deliver. But it's true that there are some concerns about the proposal, or some doubts, because the implementation will not be easy. The administrative burden of this kind of instruments can create other noises or other problems. But if we really want to keep and still and the steel industry in Europe, we need to advance soon with this proposal. And additionally, we need these revenues to repay the debt of the Next Generation EU. Yeah, and maybe this is the third point, because the Next Generation and the MFF for this period, the Parliament was able to increase the Council agreement to put more money in innovation or research or in programs Horizon Europe, and maybe from the research perspective, we need more funding. Yeah, we need more funding, not only public but also private. Yeah, and when we talk on private investment, and in the context of the green transition, we also talk about the state aid regulation. Yeah, at least in principle, the Commission has to unveil at the end of this year a new guidelines on the application of the state aid regulation, and let's see. Yeah, but we need to increase in one way or other the possibility to support public investment in steel companies to advance in the decarbonization. Yeah, so maybe and summarizing my points, we need to review the regulatory framework of electricity markets. We need to deliver fast on CBAP. We need to implement the Horizon Europe and other research funds well oriented to advance in green steel, and maybe finally the Commission will have to adapt the state aid regulation to facilitate private investment and public investment in this path. And thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Jonas. Perhaps we'll come back to some of these points in the discussion. Also, we at SEPS have run earlier this year a number of meetings on the future of the industrial strategy in the EU. Milan, in particular, was involved in the part related to state aid. So perhaps he will be able to add something on state aids in this sector specifically when his turn comes to address the audience. I want to turn now to Johanna Lehne for your remarks. Obviously, feel free to also echo what has been said until now, so that we start the discussion.
Thank you, Andrea. It's really great to be part of this discussion. So I lead E3G's work on industry transition and on trade policy. So it brings together many of the topics that we're talking about here. And we just recently published a report with partners in the US on what a 1.5 degree compliant pathway is for the steel sector globally, but also honing in on what it means for Europe. And actually, for Europe, the trajectory we're seeing is just enormous in terms of what's required in the next decade. We look at a 50% emissions reduction practically that's required by 2030. So huge challenge, which is why it's fantastic to see the work that SEPS and others have been doing in this area to sort of really color in what we need to do in this context. But you've asked us to focus on kind of key next steps, sequencing and prioritizing. So I wanted to focus on 4 key areas we see for action in the EU space on green steel. And the first is really about this shift from the kind of carbon intensive steel producing asset base we have at the moment, which is very focused on blast furnaces, to near zero emission steel technologies, which are luckily, as many others have been emphasized, really being developed in Europe at the moment. We're really moving forward on the R&D side. So how do we do that deployment side of things? The key thing to note here as well is that we have a short policy window in which to get this right. There's been fantastic research that's been looking at sort of the reinvestment pipeline in Europe, which identifies by Agora Energiewende that almost 50% of the steel capacity in Europe at the moment has to be reinvested in the next decade. So it's about how do you hit that window when that reinvestment decision has to be made and ensure that those steelmakers have the confidence to invest in cleaner technologies now rather than locking in 20 to 25 years more of carbon intensive production. And for us, this comes down to 2 key pieces. There's a huge part in terms of actually just supporting first movers in this space and supporting demonstration projects where we already are seeing critical pieces in the Fit for 55 package around carbon contracts for difference, around bolstering the innovation fund. Others, Jonas just mentioned state aid, what can happen at the kind of member state level on this front. We know that a number of member states, Germany, France, and others are considering their own kind of carbon contracts for different schemes in these areas. So again, as you noted, the importance also of how we ensure there aren't two-speed transitions here, but where we do create that space for governments to invest in this is really critical, but there will be additional funding needed here. I think that additional support has to really be balanced against also ensuring that we start to get the regulation in place that starts to disincentivize and steer producers away from carbon intensive investments. And here the key piece is really this question of free allocations, how we continue to allocate those, what they're tied to in terms of the benchmarks and what incentives we set in terms of what we're calling green, and incentivizing here versus what we're asking producers to really shift away from. And I think that is a missing piece at the moment that we haven't got quite right. The second key area for action is really around growing the market for near zero emission steel. And actually, we've seen a huge amount of momentum on this front already. So we've seen that, especially on the kind of private sector side of things, we had this in the last session, there's so much movement here. Even in Europe, we've seen Volvo's direct offtake agreement with Hybrid. We've seen fantastic work by the climate group around Steel Zero, with more than 10 companies signing up to send a really strong signal in terms of their demand for green steel. I would say that the great momentum on this front, but we still need to shift into public procurement commitments in this space and regulation that really grows this market much further than that. Otherwise, we're going to stay in a place where green steel, however we define that, continues to be a kind of niche premium product. We really need to move to mainstreaming it. Part of that is also around the work that needs to be done around how we define near zero, net zero steel. There's a lot of fantastic work, again, by Climate Group and Responsible Steel and others who are doing this. But again, that could be tied to regulatory processes in the EU. We're still waiting on the State Oil Products Initiative, on the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, different places where we could see regulation on embodied carbon in steel that could make a big difference here as well. The third key piece that I maybe would say has maybe a little bit been missing from the conversation so far, I know Susanna brought it up in the last session, is this piece on circularity and material efficiency. In our study, we really see that, up to 2050 at a global level, almost 50% of the emissions reduction comes from material efficiency and circularity for steel. This is huge. I mean, the critical factor here is that it is very reinforcing and mutually sort of compatible with a shift to more cleaner primary production as well. So as you move to material efficiency, it increases scrap availability for steel recycling. And critically, some of these pathways and ways of doing this at the moment are readily available today. And so we can basically use it now to reduce the size of the problem we have as the breakthrough technologies, as carbon capture usage and storage, as hydrogen scales up. So it's a really key part of it. And it needs a huge amount of push. It's not really happening on the private sector side. We're missing the policy framework at the moment. The EU has a good track record in circular economy, but they haven't really looked at heavy industry so far in this space. They've really focused on textiles and other issues. So really thinking it as part of the Sustainable Products Initiative, etc., how we can scale up that circularity dimension around steel as well, so that we're reducing how much primary steel we need in the first place is really critical here. And the final piece I really wanted to note here is the kind of international coordination side of it, what we need in terms of diplomacy. And of course, that the EU can play a really key role in leading on this front. We often talk about steel as a kind of trade-trapped sector. Others have noted this. There are those competitiveness dimensions. It makes it hard to sort of move by yourself as a first mover in this space, given those competitiveness dimensions. The other thing I would note is that beyond sort of carbon leakage concerns, when we're talking about green subsidies for steel, when we're talking about standards for green steel or public procurement, these are all areas that also run into difficult trade territory. So one way or another, we need to get the trade policy piece of this right. We need to get the diplomacy side of this right. We've actually seen a lot of movement on this in the last year, which has been really exciting. And even just at COP26, just ahead of COP26, we had the EU-US carbon-based sectoral arrangement for steel and aluminium announced. Obviously, loads of details that still have to be defined, and what does it mean for the EU CBAM? But it's a really exciting move in terms of bilateral commitment to using trade policy to really green steel internationally. This is one to definitely watch in the space. We had the Glasgow Steel Breakthrough, which again brought together a number of, including EU member states and the EU itself in this context, to commit to coordinated action on steel. And just this morning, I think it was the UK, India, Germany, and Canada, as part of the UNIDO Industrial Decarbonisation Initiative, who committed to much more concerted public procurements of greener steel in the space. It sends a really strong signal, and these elements are really important. But I think there's still a gap here. From India being involved in many of these initiatives, they still tend to be driven by mostly European and North American companies and countries in this context. So it's critical to think about how we make sure that we are inclusive here. The large bulk of steel production globally is going to be outside of Europe ultimately. The second key area is that although we've had great announcements, they obviously still need to be fleshed out. We need to see what it looks like on paper, how this delivers, and whether we're going to have major steelmaking economies like China be part of this and what that looks like ultimately. And the third is that the emphasis so far has very much been on convening and lessons sharing and coming together, but we actually need critical, true kind of ambitious targets that are being set in this space, and ultimately also targets around phasing out blast furnaces and starting to catalyze ambition around that. And that's what we haven't really seen so far. So I'd say there's a key role for EU leadership here. We've got a large number of multinational steel producers who are headquartered in Europe. We've got loads of great innovation happening in this space. Europe is clearly a very important potential agenda setter for the global steel market. And I'd like to see a kind of push on all four of these fronts in the next few years. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Joanna. And you pointed at a very broad range of potential hopes, but also existing elephants in the room to some extent, meaning that there are still some obstacles and some missing gaps and bits in this big puzzle, especially if we look at the transition from the big declarations, the big plans, and the transitions to actual actions. And this is, if anything, what we've been discussing now for this 2 days of conference and also throughout the Green Steel for Europe project. There's also a little bit a sense of collective action problem. Sometimes it is mentioned also with reference to what both Alejandro and Jonas have said before, meaning the idea that you need to get all the pieces of the puzzle right to motivate people to actually invest, so that some projects, to demonstrators in particular, could be and should be funded and promoted in order to show that this is real, it's possible, and it's accompanied by suitable policy and other, let's say, framework conditions that are essential for this market to really move in the right direction and at the right speed over the coming years. So avoiding sort of chicken and egg problems to some extent in this respect. And then the geopolitical issues, I would then probably get back to them at the end, because I think many of your speakers will want to have a say on this. You received on the use of, well, you probably received, or during your speech, you received a question on funding or priority use of the Innovation Fund. So I saw that Milan already answered it, but in case you want to add some comments to this, please feel free to do that, as you covered in part that issue. Katarina is asking you to share the link to the document. I see you already did that, so perfectly. We are catching up with our pending duties. So the time is now to move to Torsten, who's hyper popular in this conference, so I don't need to introduce him, and also in the Green Steel for Europe project. So Torsten, I give you the floor again. As for the others, feel free to comment also what you've heard until now.
So, yeah, thank you, Andrea. I want to bring on some topics from the view of R&D into the discussion. One was already raised by Johanna just recently. So regarding the circular economy, one of these aspects is the secondary steel making by scrap, obviously. We did not really look into this in detail in the Green Steel project, as we were focusing on the main emission-intensive primary production via blast furnace production. So this is an open issue. Wisely, I showed yesterday our last scenario. There's a strong potential. We see it about 15% on the long term. So that at the same time, that doesn't say that this is the solution of the main part of the problem. So we know that the scrap exports are rather limited, and we have to consider that each ton of scrap which is exported globally on the global level saves also emissions outside Europe. So the current projects, a lot of projects which definitely make sense both from a circular economy point of view, also from a technical point of view, is that they minimize the downgrading, which is currently still state of art. And of course, that does make sense. However, it's still a bit difficult to estimate the overall potential on long term of those activities. They just have started mainly. So this is the first aspect I want to raise. The second aspect is the increased need for R&D within the next decades. Generally, it was already discussed, but I want to point out some special aspects. So currently, we usually talk about TRLs regarding the maturity from about 1 to 9. So 9 means to have we have industrial validation. However, in the steel industry, this should not be, or this is not the end, in fact. So if we talk about different scales, we have scale, left scale, then we talk about, let's say, 100 grams a day. Then we have pilot scale, then we talk about 100 kilograms or maybe 1,000 kilograms a day. Then we have a demo scale. So the main scope of the Clean Steel Partnership also, then we talk about 10 or 100 tons a day. But the industrial plants, they are rising from 1,000 to 5,000 tons a day. So this is still a very huge step, and there are strong differences from the operational and process point of view. So this is something which must not be overlooked. So we should introduce something like a TRL 10 or 11 for this. So funding programs like the RCS project, which is quite close to those high TRLs, they will become even more important in the next years in order to speed up this industrial deployment of the new technologies. That is one aspect. And the other aspect is that we also must not overlook all those intermediate states we have. Yesterday, I already mentioned that we will have for the next 10 days mostly integrated works as a kind of mixed technology routes with some blast furnaces remaining, some new electric arc furnaces, maybe some direct reduction furnaces. So usually these plants are called integrated works. And they are called integrated works because they have thoroughly been integrated with regard to the energy usage and also with regard to the gas cycles and the material cycles and the recycling cycles over decades or even 100 years or more. So that will take some time, and we will have a lot of different steps, a stepwise transition. And all of these steps, they have to be optimized to have a sustainable and sustainable steel production within these years. So this is a huge task, and it is closely linked to a circular economy as well. We will probably not have sinter plants on long term anymore, but the sinter plants are currently the center of the circular economy in the integrated works. So we have to replace them. We have to have a new integration of the gas and energy cycles up to that we need extensive external electricity supply for most integrated works. Now they produce their own electricity from the blast furnace gas, but that will not be available anymore. So there are a lot of different aspects, and all of those different steps along the next decades, they have to be optimized, and that is a huge task. And finally, Maria already raised yesterday the demand that we will have additional projects in the future, like the Green Steel project. And I really want to confirm this task. Susanna pointed out that we need to speed up. And this is really the impression I already got. So I presented some scenarios. And basically, they were developed about half a year ago, collecting information from the last year. And if you have a look now have a look on those scenarios, you have the feeling that they are already out of date. So time is really running so fast. So we have to put in the actual framework conditions. We did not really consider the Fit for 55 aspects and such sort of things. We did not really consider the very new latest versions of the company roadmaps. So that is an ongoing task with very, very fast steps, one after each other. And inside the Green Steel project, also, we missed out some other aspects, as I already mentioned, the secondary steel production. We did not really look at this. Even it is quite important, in particular, if since the electric arc furnaces have to be integrated into the integrated works. The downstream processes, we did not really look at this, although it is a significant part of it. And also, the industrial decarbonization steps, like Susanna said, we need it from 2025 up on. We really had some rough estimations for 2030 and 2050, but that does not really look into the detailed steps we need within the next years. So that is important to plan this further on. And the last point I want to raise regarding a follow-up task for a green steel project or something similar is something which was already mentioned. That is, we need to have communication and coordination across the different industries, across the different hubs. Like Susanna said, we need friends. We need to have contact to our friends. We need to have a coordinated approach. And in particular, with regard to renewable energy production in the steel industry, it was always said in our boundary condition when we thought about those scenarios, that was the prognosis about the available renewable energy. And it was quite limited, and that was why we assumed such low hydrogen enrichment rates in our scenarios. It could be twice as much or even more. So there's a high potential for CO2 mitigation, but we need those renewable energies. So, and also what was mentioned, the industrial synergies across different industries. So this is also a topic which needs a lot of discussion. And from my point of view, the Green Steel project, which already collected a lot of those things from the technology to the funding to the finances, was a very important step with a very constructive work, and this should really be continued with extended focus, considering although also the aspects I mentioned.
Thank you very much, Torsten. And I think we can carry this also to the final Q&A, sort of final discussion. But it seems to me that very often projects that are funded at EU level, but perhaps Alejandro will have a different view here, have the problem that they come to an end, and a lot of very, very valuable knowledge that could be further exploited is either put in a drawer or sort of becomes more sparse, perhaps in the corridors of the European Commission, and perhaps sometimes ends up impacting future policy choices. And it's important to give continuity to this research. And as you say, there are many aspects that cannot be considered until now. There are new aspects that could not be considered until now. And in the spirit of enabling also on the Commission side, what we call sometimes foresight and also an update of the emerging landscape, both at the international level, but also in technology terms, so horizon scanning, I think it would be very interesting to have a follow-up project that looks at the full value chain, that looks at the also at ways to establish a potential constant updating of the threat landscape or risk landscape, let's say at the international, and the opportunity landscape at the technological level. So perhaps we carry this also were some of the final thoughts that we have. I want to move now to Pietro. Yeah. And Pietro, you'll probably be in continuity with some of these considerations, but also venturing into some of the other framework conditions that are supposed to be there for us to be able to embark into this very important venture. Pietro, I give you the floor.
Thank you very much, Andrea. I think that you can hear me properly. Okay, fine. So I can go on. So in the green steel, we tackle exactly the part related to the framework condition from financial point of view related to the various programs, European, national, and regional level. So in that sense, I have to say that a lot of work has been carried out I mean, especially at European level by the various institutions where they already try to provide quite a wide set of instruments, of financial instruments, to be used in the coming year, already now and the coming year, in order to support all technological development that has been underlined just a few minutes ago by Thorsten, and also during the work and in the yesterday webinar. In that sense, such a positive approach of the various institutions is really a strong reality. We have a lot of instruments that are being adapted for such a decarbonization path. So even there is a fund for coal steel included some criteria in order to much more focus on decarbonization, as well as for Horizon Europe, about the CSP and the big ticket initiative that has been carried out by STEP and Aerofair jointly. But also there are other instruments that are mainly supporting also both CAPEX and OPEX, and especially referring to OPEX, the Innovation Fund, as well as, let's say, more in general with a big dimension, the Next Generation Europe instrument, or the IPCI hydrogen that is quite well advanced. So when Thorsten was saying the frame in a few months is fully changed, certainly we described and we still something that later on during the months has really strong change. Starting from this very positive approach, a lot of work has been done. I would like to underline some key issues. Sometimes synergies and using of both programs, a European, a national, regional level, is not that easy. Especially, let's say, a national, regional level, the instruments have to be updated. And this is a key point, because later on the frame is European, but the implementation is local. For instance, the PCI for hydrogen will follow a general frame, a European frame, but later on will be implemented with the national and regional rules. The second point I would like to underline is really related to the project of very big dimension. So we saw in the past days and today making reference about a project of the dimension of 1 billion. So for this type of project, we feel that the proper instruments, both on the private side and the public side, can be further better exploited in order to go in this big step changing and technological approach. Making in line a comment with the Thorsten comments about a different type of technology, in the calls that we have prepared up to now with the institution, a proper TRL tuning phase has still to be done. Tuning of TRL as well as timing. So sometimes the calls are, let's say, quite going in the same period. This is good because we have a lot of money, but sometimes we are also not, let's say, unable to catch all the opportunities. So also timing, that apparently is really, let's say, quite obvious aspect, is something important. And speaking about synergy among different programs is not fully clear if we are going in a proper direction about the approach and the real usage of different type of instruments. So I can speak directly myself, because I know also that there are a lot of company and people around this table round that are really well expert about the fact. But for instance, EPCI, we are already working since, let's say, 15 months on those type of things. And rules are not really, let's say, fully clear. If we want to go for investment, and I'm speaking about investment in the steel industry, but as well also in infrastructure, because some energy should arrive to the plant in order to produce a green steel. Could be green electricity or green hydrogen. Those infrastructure are extremely important. Sometimes permitting is really a part that is really blocking the real implementation. We are speaking about months in order to go in this direction. let's go to the last point. I see maybe Jan would like to press us in order to go a bit faster. Specific instruments for CO2 for decarbonization. EPCI for hydrogen has been really appreciated. Big instruments are really appreciated. Innovation fund is really interesting for OPEX and for CAPEX. If we want to go also for decarbonizing, a strong part should be dedicated to CO2 reduction, and a possible EPCI on low CO2 emission industries is something that we could expect that they are really willing to come. Maybe Andrea, I don't know if I was too fast, maybe we have time constraints. Those were my comments. I can speculate more. When we are thinking about modernization of steel industry, we are thinking also about modernization of energy infrastructure in Europe. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Pietro. Yeah, no, we will speed you up. I don't know if Jen raised her hand, but I don't know if she had a question or not. I think we're coming to the end of this round of interventions. We're also collecting the questions on the Q&A, which helps us sort of maximize the content that goes into this this session. And then I will give you everybody a quick the possibility to have a 1 minute, let's say, feedback reaction at the end of this panel on what you've heard, and perhaps if you want to add something. But this leads me to Milan. Milan, you have already illustrated the policy options, but perhaps you want to go a little bit deeper on some of the next steps that you think are needed going forward, and obviously you can comment on some of the things that have been said by the other speakers. So I give you the floor. Thanks for being again a speaker in this event.
Sure, thanks, Andrea. What I'd like to start with is a point that has been raised several times on the importance of being able to combine and blend several funding sources. And I do think it's important to keep in mind that a lot of these sources of money, they have very specific purposes. And that's a good thing. I mean, some might be specifically for early stage innovation, others for deployment, whether for CapEx or OPEX. But yeah, being able to combine is always a good thing, provided that we can accept that there are specific purposes for a reason. Two have been mentioned in particular: the Research Fund for Coal and Steel and the Clean Steel Partnership. Now, the numbers associated with that are 111 million euros and 700 million euros, which are nice numbers. Definitely, something where you can do some investment with. But if you then compare it with the 70 billion in combined OPEX and CAPEX mentioned by Eurofair an hour and a half ago, there's a significant gap. Also, if we compare it to the 6 billion in free allocation value that is given to the steel industry every year, it's a completely different order of magnitude. So I think, there still is some gap also between the hard money that is available and what we know that will need to be invested in the future. And ideally, that should be private money. And for that, we need a market and we need pass-through to final consumers. The good news, perhaps, is that if you look at the impact of higher steel prices on a lot of products, then many customers will be able to bear that without too much trouble. So it's really more about managing the competition on the materials itself. We've also heard a bit about some of the upcoming developments in EU policy, and the Fit for 55 package has nearly 4,000 pages of proposals, many of which are very relevant to the steel sector. One thing to keep in mind is that it will be, of course, attractive for the EU to devise policies that are not always targeted at one sector. I mean, for the steel sector, it's a bit easier to justify with so many tons of emissions, but we have another 100 ETS sectors that need to reach net zero in 28 years. So anything that is cross-sectoral is attractive. On the market for green steel, I think there has been good news. Even yesterday at COP, there was a statement coming out saying that a few countries had come together saying that, well, talking to industry, if you are able to produce green steel, green cement, we will buy it. I think that's a very powerful statement, and it shows also that governments really acknowledge this importance of the market. On the timeline, yeah, there are some very almost concerning statements about that a lot of investment, irrespective of sort of the carbon intensity of the investments, will need to be done very soon because of yeah, the lifetime of some assets. If we combine that with yeah, the near certainty of a lot more significant scarcity in the ETS, then it really is yeah, a crunch point now and in the next 2 years. On the electricity market, this was brought up a few times and is a very current topic because of the high energy prices we are seeing. And we see some countries and co-legislators arguing in favor of doing more with average pricing. I think that's an understandable sentiment. At the same time, we also need to consider what happens to yeah, the investment signals in that sector, with the need to provide for flexibility services by utilities. And a lot of them are based at very high marginal prices. So perhaps it's also an idea to really look at the distributional impacts, but acknowledge that marginal pricing can also be an important price signal to actually deliver the type of investments you need to have an electricity system with a high share of renewables. Finally, on state aid, I mean, there are real challenges with supporting OPEX specifically. That is the most, well, I wouldn't say dubious, but the most challenging kind of state aid, where the Commission and the Court are not keen to say yes to. But as we have seen from the investment needs of the Green Steel project, that's really where a lot of attention will be needed. There's also the challenge of technology neutrality. Do you want to support single yeah, technology groups like hydrogen or CCS that can apply to multiple sectors? Or would it really help to yeah, have, for example, an IPCEI for an entire value chain so that you can be more comprehensive in the support? I'd also like to re-emphasize a point brought up by Johanna already, that yeah, the fiscal capacities of member states to, for example, provide carbon contracts for differences differ significantly between member states, and we would not like to see divergences in the internal market. And this means that while state aid is inevitable because of the deep pockets of member states, we should still be looking at EU instruments as well to make sure that it's an EU-wide transition. Then my final comment would be on roadmaps. They've been discussed quite lengthily also yesterday. There have been many of them also while this project was already underway. And even though there is some merit in considering for example, the more detail that might be necessary if you look at the IEA roadmap. If you compare many of them and also the results of the first two work packages of green steel, there's a lot of overlaps of, if you just accept the net zero by 2050 constraint. We know that it will be a combination of green hydrogen based steelmaking, CCUS, and doing more with secondary steelmaking, and maybe in the longer run something like molten oxide electrolysis is very promising. So in that light, it might also make sense to focus more on what is already known and really go into the deployment discussion rather than the early stage technology readiness levels. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Milan, which might be a potential agenda for a follow-up project rather than only focusing on the roadmaps, looking at what we have learned and how this translates into a call for action and a possible series of steps from a policy, from a financial, from a technological perspective. We're coming close to the end of this panel. Our keynote for the last part of this event has already joined us, which is perhaps makes it a very good moment to call on our colleague Christian to show what has happened while you were talking on the poll that we launched. So Christian, you want to show it to us? So, okay, so we have a winner apparently, and which elements will play the most crucial role in advancing the decarbonization of the EU steel industry. I'll just go quickly through these results, and then I propose that we take 1 minute each to the different speakers if you want to have something. So starting in going in the same order. So we'll go back to Alejandro. Meanwhile, there is a comment in the Q&A, which is more of an open comment in case you want to have a look at it, and in case you have an interest in responding to that comment rather than a question for the panelists themselves. So renewable electricity seems to be the element that will play the most crucial role in advancing the decarbonization of the EU steel industry. Then funding, green hydrogen, as Milan just said, it's quite well established that it will play an important role. Carbon pricing, CBAM, market creation, availability of scrap, innovation, and then sector coupling, CCUS, and interestingly, corporate responsibility. I don't know how you interpret this result, or whether you think that alone corporate responsibility will not be the game changer, or whether you have a different interpretation from this. So let's try to go into these final minutes of our session into the interpretation of, quick interpretation of these results. And if you want to add anything within the 60 seconds that you will have, I will invite you to do so. Alejandro, you want to take the floor?
Thank you, Andrea. Just fairly quickly, yeah, our worst fears are confirmed. Yeah, we are very dependent on renewable and electricity and electricity prices, production, etc. Well, I mean, this is good to the good news is that we somehow know this. We are towards the organization. We are very much aware. So as Jonas said, fairly straight before, that we need to do policies that go hand in hand with those electricity policies. This is very important for the independence of Europe, which it's in a particular somehow position as regards their energy somehow dependence in the current moment, and how this decarbonization is also aiming to having independence. Just a quick one: innovation didn't come up too high, but it's I would say like is a cornerstone for everything to having. I mean, we cannot like decarbonize without innovation. Of course, Milan said the cost of total cost of running the whole transition, 70 billion, compares to more, I would say, to the like, let's say the revenues of the 5 largest steel companies in the world is 300 billion, compares more to that than to revenue. As we know, the further so up the line, closer to lower TRLs, the lower the cost, the lower, but probably the bigger the impacts too. So and then along the line, I was saying before, I wanted to stress out that yes, the research fund is 700 billion for an effort that we consider would cost like around 2.5 billion all in all to industry. So that's a fair good contribution. But of course, further down the line, we have other funds up to the 750 billion of the recovery fund. And of course, loans, leverage. I mean, we can accompany that, but we need to leave the sectors to develop themselves, like by private funds, investment, etc. So this is where the combination needs to come into place. Okay.
Thanks a lot, Alejandro. I see that Jonas is not with us, so I move directly to Johanna for her final comments.
Yeah, Andrea. Yeah, really interesting poll. I mean, I think renewable electricity was also one of my top picks, so I would definitely endorse that. We know that we need it when we're thinking about greener hydrogen production. We know that we need it when we're thinking about electric arc furnaces and steel recycling. So really ensuring that upstream production becomes much cleaner, that we massively invest in it, and that's in line with what we need in lots of other sectors. So I think it's a kind of no-brainer to see a huge amount of investment in that space. I just also wanted to note how far down CCUS is, and I really think this speaks to how much the picture has changed just over the last year. Even in our study that I linked to earlier, CCUS plays a role. It's always easy to throw it into roadmaps as something, especially I think for us, it's like 10-15% of the final mitigation in 2050. But it was really notable when we were doing that research how much steel producers aren't thinking about CCUS anymore. It really isn't on their radar as specific things that they're focusing on, even in geographies like China, where we thought, okay, there's a huge existing steel base here, a young blast furnace steel capacity base that needs to be decarbonised. CCUS is really not one of the primary levers they're thinking about anymore. And to Milan's point about other sectors, I think this is a critical question then for other sectors who need CCUS. What does that mean for them in terms of that infrastructure deployment and that demand? I think this really does change the picture for heavy industry on this front. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Johanna, and thanks also for giving an interpretation of the results of the poll. I'll ask you maybe to do a similar thing to Thorsten in his final minute of comments.
Yeah, I would also like to appreciate the results of the poll. And what I also want to end with today is, again, I know that I speak on behalf of the whole Green Steel Consortium, that we are excited and willing to go on with the work. We have now the network all over on this topic. We have now the models, and that could be a good catalyst to go on with the new boundary conditions, with the speed up we need, with the coordination to the hydrogen availability, electricity availability, including a stronger focus on the industrial deployment, because the main part of the, let's say, basic development, research and development issue is finished now. So we can look into the real mitigation aspects and its optimization.
Yeah, road towards the TRL 10, if possible. Pietro, your comments before we wrap up with Milan.
Okay, so really appreciate the results of the pool. I will try to give some explanation, at least from my perception. So certainly agree about renewable electricity, green hydrogen has been already commented, so I will pass through. Of course, tackling in the green steel the part about funding, I know the pressure that there is about funding, so second place is quite appreciated, but I will comment the point about innovation. Because today, and on the basis of our experience, there are two different situations. On one side, the real steel expert that knows quite the system, know that there are a little process that can be implemented, but into reality, they want to see a real demonstration of those activities. And on the other side, there are a lot of companies that are providing plans. They are saying the technology already exists. So such in the middle way of real demonstration is this perception and give this, let's say, aid position to innovation. I think there is a lot to demonstrate, to have awareness and perception from the general public, including researchers and industrial people. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Pietro. Loud and clear. Milan, your final thoughts before we hand over to Hien to introduce the final speaker of this conference.
Sure. No, I think it's great whenever a poll like that results in a very clear winner. I perhaps had not expected that renewables would be that far ahead. Well, on renewables, the IEA has said it's the cheapest electricity source in history. We have a 60 euro carbon price. We have a renewables target at the EU level still to be met. And practically every sector in the economy will need a whole lot of it. So member states really have all the reasons to accelerate their efforts greatly on deployment of renewables.
Thank you. Perfect, Milan. And I think it's a very good way to wrap up this session. I think all the attendees, including myself as moderator, we've learned a lot from you. We've also, I think, gotten a pretty clear view of what needs to be done going forward, including on the research side, and hopefully on the research side, continuing these activities that have been, that led us until now to get a fairly good view of what the steps are going forward. So perhaps I hand over to Hien to lead us into the final step. But before that, I want to thank all the panelists for a very, very interesting session. And Hien, over to you for the introduction of our final speaker, Rosalinde.
Many thanks, Andrea, and to the panelists and also the participant who joined in the phone. So it's very exciting to see the results. So I'll now give the floor to Ms. Rosalind van der Vlies. She's the Clean Planet Director at DG Research to give the concluding remarks for this session.
Yes, thank you very much. And let me first start by thanking all the participants in the Green Steel project and also all the participants in this very, very important conference, and also congratulate the conference organizers with organizing this event. I think, of course, we in the European Union and with the COP going on, we are in a very important point in time where we can really reap the benefits and the opportunities to decarbonize our economies. And of course, the steel sector will play a crucial role in all this. You probably will have seen that the leaders at the COP earlier this week concluded the Glasgow breakthroughs, which includes also the steel sector. So I think there's a lot of momentum to be had. And of course, this is not only about climate change, this is also about creating growth and jobs and to make sure that we can grow and learn together. From the European Commission side, we are very much enthusiastic to contribute and support. I mean, we heard today that there are a lot of barriers and hurdles to be overcome, be it regulatory barriers, also investment barriers. And of course, I'm very happy that we have the Clean Steel Partnership, which receives funding from both Horizon Europe program and also the Research Fund for Coal and Steel that will be there together with the industry to make sure that we can also support the whole process from the research and innovation perspective. So I really hope that the lessons that we also learned from this project, it will also help us to further shape, identify priorities and implement the Clean Steel Partnership in the years to come. And also it will feed into the further refinement of developing the strategic research and innovation agenda for the Clean Steel Partnership. So I really hope that now we can move to the next level and we can start further deployment of the results of the Clean Steel projects and to really contribute also to the competitiveness of the European steel industry. So let me again thank everybody for the very interesting discussions, active participation. I really believe that we can only make progress and only lead the way towards a zero carbon society if we all work together. So basically we are all part of Team Clean Steel and let's take this opportunity and this momentum to make it happen. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. van der Vlies. I myself and many colleagues here actually have been working on the Clean Steel Partnership, so we're happy to see some support from your side. So with your remarks, the conference officially closed now. Before we officially end, I'd just like to remind that this conference has been live streamed on YouTube. So in case you want to rewatch it or want to share it with your networks, please feel free to go to the SEP's YouTube channel. You can find it there. And then many thanks again to all of you, and we too look forward to working with you in future to really accelerate the decarbonization of the steel industry. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.